Hey, my name is Dennis Gill with the Americans in Wartime Experience. Today's date is 18 November 2024, and I've got the pleasure of speaking with Jeff McCausland, and we are doing our interview today virtually. Thank you, Jeff, for sitting down and agreeing to do an interview with us today.
Dennis, it's great to be with you.
Where are you located right now?
I'm physically located at my offices at Dickinson College here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, about 2 hours north and west of Washington.
Okay. If you could just give us a little bit of background on who you are. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I was born and raised in West Central Illinois, actually born in Decatur, Illinois, and lived in Illinois as a young man. Probably spent most of my time, my father was in the grocery and meat business in a small town in West Central Illinois called Beardstown, Illinois. I graduated from high school there in 1968. And thought I would like a military career. And furthermore, of course, back in those days, there was conscription. So you were going in the military one way or the other. So I decided I was going to try to go to the military academy at West Point, which I pursued. And I was selected, nominated to go to West Point, entered the academy in 1968, and graduated with the class of 1972 and was commissioned in the field artillery. Following graduation from West Point, completed the U.S. Army Airborne and Ranger schools, and then went off to course of the Field Artillery Basic course at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, prior to going to Europe, and spent a good percentage of my career over the next 30 years in Europe, probably 14 or 15 years in Europe, because that was during the Cold War, and that's where a large percentage of the United States Army was deployed.
Right. Did you have any family members that were military, either past, present?
Yeah, that's interesting. In a way, no. Well, I had one uncle that was a career Air Force officer. He had been an Air Force officer or Air Corps officer during World War II. Was left the Air Force or Air Corps after the war ended, and then was called back during Korea and decided to stay. But beyond that, no one was a career military person, though all of them served. My father, for example, was in the Army at the onset of World War II. His enlistment ran out in 1942. And he told me one time he was told, you can re-enlist or you can get out and we're going to draft you back in about 6 weeks or so. So he actually joined the Merchant Marines and spent the war on Liberty ships going back and forth across the Atlantic, which was a pretty dangerous thing to do. Then I had an uncle, and he ended up being in the Marines, was in the 1st Marine Division at Chosin Reservoir in Korea during the Korean War, but then he left the Marine Corps after the war was over. And then my older brother actually, of course, went in the Army in the late 1960s as an enlisted man as well, and ended up in Vietnam. And as I always say, he ended up in the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and then, some 25 years or so later, I ended up in the Gulf War. And then subsequently I have a nephew who was deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq. And sadly, he died in my opinion, due to his injuries he sustained in the war in Iraq.
Okay. When you joined the Army, did you have any idea what direction you wanted your career to go in?
No. I mean, I was a young man. I was convinced of, frankly, Dennis, a couple things. One is I was in this small town surrounded by soybean fields and hog lots, and I was convinced the one thing I was going to do was get the hell out of there. Okay. And so going to West Point, if you got out a map, was about as far from that town, still inside the continental United States, as you could get. So that was attractive. Obviously, the cost of going to the academy was attractive from getting a good education. And number three, my father had served, my uncles had served. I knew I wanted to serve. But of course, it also meant the opportunity to travel around the world in different assignments. And that seemed to me to be something I wanted to do. But my basic belief was, I was going to give that a chance. We were required upon graduation, obviously, to serve for about 5 years, and then decide if you're going to stay or not. And frankly, a substantial majority of my classmates did, in fact, leave the Army sometime after their 5-year commitment. But I enjoyed it. I liked being in the Army. I liked being in the Army in Europe. I liked the challenges, the opportunity to move around. And so one thing led to another, and there I was 30 years later.
So you get deployed first once you graduate the academy, and you go to your schools. Eventually, you go to Europe, correct?
Yes.
And that's in support of the Cold War, essentially.
Yeah, I was in the 7th U.S. Corps. And I always thought it was interesting because we really had a wartime mission. In other words, we knew exactly when the balloon went up, exactly where we were physically going to go down to individual gun positions. If we could get there before the Russians got there, let's put it that way. And that gave it a reality that I found very, very interesting. So you had your GDP plans and you planned all that kind of stuff out. In fact, early in my career in 1973, we were deployed up for an exercise called Reforger, where they brought all the troops over. You probably heard about that. And that occurred during the Yom Kippur War in Israel. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, the Russian Soviets threatened to send troops to Egypt in support of the Egyptians against the Israelis. And President Richard Nixon put us on general alert. So there we are, a few miles from the East German border, being put on general alert, being told to go pick up our basic load of ammo, et cetera, which gave that a whole new reality.
Right. You're stationed in Germany at this time?
Yeah, I was stationed in a place called Ulm, Germany, which is about in the south, about halfway between Munich and Stuttgart.
Okay. And you guys are essentially training and preparing for what, should there be the kickoff of hostilities, the Russian or the Soviets at that time invading through Germany, yeah. Correct? You're basically ready and waiting for that to happen.
Yeah, so you're studying real intelligence on what Soviet units or what East German or Warsaw Pact units would likely appear in the sector that you were responsible for. You were studying Russian military doctrine, how they were going to deploy their forces. You were studying Russian military equipment for their particular vulnerabilities, and obviously, continue to train your unit to be prepared to do that. Which, in a way, not jumping ahead, but I thought was also interesting because, lo and behold, we did that in my career from when I arrived in 1973 until 1990, when I'm now back in Europe. I deployed a battalion from Germany to Saudi Arabia for Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And I think what few people realize is the units in Germany trained. They had a mission. We looked upon ourselves as deployed. Mm-hmm. Okay. We didn't look at the units in Europe as going someplace else. But right. That's how it ironically turned out, that we deployed from Europe then to Southwest Asia. So I got to tell you, when that in the November of 1990, when George Herbert Walker Bush ordered the 7th Corps to do that, there was no plan whatsoever to deploy that corps anywhere except to the inter-German border. And so we kind of made it up on the fly.
Right. And how real was the possibility in your mind and in the troops that you served with? How real was that possibility that the Soviets would actually invade?
A couple of times it was pretty doggone real. Like I said, back in the Yom Kippur War in 73, and I remember I was a forward observer assigned to an infantry battalion. And so I'm up there near the border, and I had a PRC 77 radio, which some people will remember, didn't have a great deal of range. And I'm picking up all these Russian transmissions on my radio, which meant they weren't that terribly far away.
Right.
And of course, we would go up on the border because when I went back for my second tour and my time in the Gulf War, our mission was in direct support of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. And the 11th ACR and the 2nd ACR had the real world mission of patrolling the border every single day. Okay. So as part of our support for them, we would go up and spend time with them periodically, physically on the border, at the border camps, going on patrols of the border. And there you were with the fence and the minefields, and the East Germans primarily on the other side. The Soviets never, to the best of my knowledge, never manned those particular sites along the inter-German border. They were back, and they left that particular task to the East Germans. And then you'd go to Berlin, and I was in Berlin a couple of times. And of course, the stark reality of the Cold War was in Berlin, without a doubt. And so I was in Berlin a couple of months ago, and it was almost amusing to go down to Checkpoint Charlie, which has a McDonald's right now. And it was a whole different place if you went up there in the 70s, the 80s, or even as late as 1990,
Right.
and a real belief that the Soviets might attack. And again, not only in 73, but then when there were disturbances in Poland, when the Soviets shot down KL-007, a Korean airliner. One time, an American officer was killed by the Soviets, who was part of a Soviet military liaison mission, which was part and parcel of the settlement from the war. Operating in East Germany, he was killed. Obviously, tensions rose. We could tell they were moving around, and we moved around too.
Yeah. Yeah. I find it interesting that you mentioned that you considered yourself deployed. A lot of people, when they look at the Cold War, they really don't think of it as a war. But in many aspects, it was. It was an actual war. Troops were deployed to the front lines, and you were at times face to face with the Soviets.
Yeah, and furthermore, I think people forget that our dependents went with us. Not unlike Korea, where most dependents do not go to Korea. Okay, so there were probably at one time or another, I think we were up to around almost 250,000 soldiers in Germany in particular, Italy a little bit, Greece a little bit. But there probably were nearly 200,000 dependents, wives and kids, okay? And many people thought they were kind of the hostages, or the Germans I know from talking to them, German leadership, really thought those families were an essential aspect of deterrence. They said, the American government might pull out the troops, but they're damn sure not going to abandon 200,000 women and children, okay?
Right.
And so part of our wartime planning was not only for us to deploy up to the border and pick up our ammo and do all the things we needed to do if war actually broke out, but part of the planning was how these people and when they were going to be evacuated, okay, out of the combat zone. Frankly, I know there was a lot of planning on paper. I'm not sure we planned that. We operationalized that to the degree that we probably should have, number one.
Right.
And number two, there was always a concern if in a crisis a decision was made to remove the families, even though that wasn't, you could say, a military decision, that would be construed by the Soviets as enormously escalatory. If the Americans pull out the civilians, that we're pretty serious here.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. How long were you in Germany?
Well, altogether about 14 years, but they were in multiple assignments. I spent 4 years in Ulm, then came back to the United States and at Fort Stewart, taught for a year, 3 years at West Point, went back to Europe for another 3 years in a place called Ansbach, came back to the United States on an unusual assignment. I was at Harvard University as a postdoctoral fellow, and then the Pentagon, and then went back next for 3 years to command a battalion that wound up in Desert Storm. And oddly enough, at the end of Desert Storm, because of course the Cold War had also ended, the Soviet Union had dissolved, the last thing I did as a battalion commander was move my battalion from Germany and redeploy them and families, dogs, cats, and goldfish back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma as part of the drawdown of forces that occurred in the aftermath of the Cold War. And then last but not least, I was sent over to Europe on a pretty nice assignment for a year as a senior fellow at a place called the Marshall Center down in Garmisch, which does policy analysis and development for senior officers all across Europe and Eastern Europe.
Yeah. Overall, how would you say that your time, how did you enjoy your time, or did you enjoy your time in Germany?
Well, I enjoyed my time a great deal in Germany. Of course, it was helpful by the fact that my wife is German. So I met and married her over there, and that made probably all the difference because she was very happy living in Germany. Her family was there. They were a great bunch of people, without a doubt. So for the whole extended family, for my kids being able to have access to their grandparents was all very, very, very nice. And I could speak pretty good German. To some degree, I will have to say, though, I might have been not a better or worse case, but an unusual case. I think for many American service members, the whole Germany thing was somewhat isolating to them. Okay, they couldn't speak the language. They enjoyed being there, but They really wanted, to get back to the United States. I think far too many of them, frankly, preserved their leave time. So they had a bulk of leave. When they took leave, they'd go back to the United States, which I thought was unfortunate. And I used to tell young officers, look, you may never get back here again. So for God's sake, take the opportunity to learn more about Europe in general and appreciate the culture.
Yeah. How about the German people? Were they receptive to having Americans there?
Yeah, they really were. And I think by and large, they, I think, took a lot more. We talk about how much over and over in my other work in the Pentagon and elsewhere, there's all these arguments about the United States pays this and the Germans or the French or the Brits pay that, and who pays enough money. And that's an easy calculus because you can just count dollars and cents.
Right.
But it really doesn't betray the total cost at all. Okay. So, for example, every year we ran this reforger exercise. I was in the 1st Division Forward, 1 brigade Germany, 2 brigades back at Fort Riley, Kansas. And those two brigades and other units would come over to test our ability to resupply Europe. And we go on a massive 2 or 3 week maneuver. So you got American tanks and howitzers driving through, German farm fields. I've seen tanks with mud up over the front slope of the tank. I've seen a 175 howitzer that missed a curve and now is stuck in a German house that it ran into that we couldn't pull out because the roof was going to collapse. I mean, auto accidents. But the Germans basically put up with all that, okay, because they understood that we were there to deter the Soviets. So it may not be dollars and cents. The damages that we did during reforgers were in the millions and millions of dollars to German civilian infrastructure, property, roads, et cetera, et cetera. And they put up with this every year. And I really often thought, I don't think an equivalent American farming community would put up with that. You know what I mean? To the degree they did. Of course, they would not perceive the threat as the Germans did. But they, by and large, put up with that.
Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting. And most people don't really think about this, but, we've never experienced that in this country. We don't have foreign troops stationed here. We don't have foreign bases here. Like Europe does.
Right.
It must be odd, I would think, to be living in that time where you've got United States troops all over the place, bases all over the place, almost like they're infringing on your country.
Yeah, and a column of American tanks or American howitzers or whatever driving right through the center of your town and screwing up the traffic and tearing up the roads and doing all that while they were doing it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Tell me about your thoughts when the wall came down, when the Cold War officially ends.
Yeah, I was there. I was in Germany at the time the wall came down. And of course, it was extraordinary. And it was amazing to me that this thing called the Soviet Union, right? That we had devoted so much energy and effort to study and understand its strengths and its weaknesses. And I know from my time in the Pentagon and the White House, tons of people at CIA headquarters and DIA spent their whole career studying the Soviet Union. And when it collapses in 1991, it's still a surprise, And I've often said, I'd like to do a research, which I'll never get around to doing, in the major literature, in 89, 90, and 91, and find anybody that predicted that was about to happen. Nobody predicted that would happen. So A, it was somewhat extraordinary. B, I think one of the things that was done very, very well, and one of the reasons why I frankly admire President George Herbert Walker Bush a great deal, was having devoted all that resources and manpower for years and years. You might say that was the day for a big victory parade. We had a victory parade after the Gulf War in Germany for some of the units. That was the day for a big victory parade, a big celebration. Let's go spike the football in the end of the end zone here, right?
Right.
And Bush, I think very wise said, no. This ain't the time to spike the football, okay? There's going to be another day, and we don't want to humiliate the Russians, the Russian leadership, Gorbachev in particular, at this particular moment. I thought that was a very, very wise thing to do. And then the whole changeover in Germany as they tried to go through reunification. And they're still here now. What are we? 40 years later?
Yeah, almost.
Um, yeah, they are, or 35 years at least. They are still undergoing that particular effort to knit this country back together. And then the economic costs were just extraordinary. And last but not least, and on a funny note, when the wall comes down in the fall of 1990, I guess 1990, we were going on some exercises. These were exercises because we thought we might get deployed, frankly, to Southwest Asia, which had been Saddam had invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. So I remember being on the Autobahn and, with all my tracked vehicles, and we're moving into a position or whatever. And one of the problems at that moment on the Autobahn was congested with these awful East German cars. Okay. You call it Trabant. I don't know if you ever knew what a Trabant was. The East Germans had two cars. One was called a Trabant, and one was called a Wartburg. And these were awful cars. I mean, they just belched smoke, top speed, maybe 50 miles an hour going downhill. And so you got this highway now congested with all these East German cars. Well, at the same time, of course, you got the West Germans who are driving around their Porsches and BMWs, and they want to go 100 miles an hour. So it was amazing to watch this tiny picture of what had just happened going down this Autobahn, the American military, all these flashy West German cars, and these guys trying to get somewhere in these beat up old East German vehicles.
Right. Preceding the wall coming down a few years was Reagan makes his speech where he says, says to Gorbachev, tear down this wall. A lot of people said he shouldn't have said that it might provoke something. What were your thoughts when you heard him say that?
Yeah, I think, in '89, I must have been in the Pentagon. I believe I was in the Pentagon at that time. It was provocative, but he had spoken with Gorbachev, and they had tried to establish some type of relationship. They had done some things on arms control. We were heavily involved. I was involved in the Pentagon on which we finally did sign, a thing called the CFE Treaty, which was a mammoth treaty on conventional weapons. Still asserting that the United States stood behind the Germans, stood behind all those things and the values that we espoused, I still thought was very appropriate. Could it have derailed the efforts they were doing? Perhaps. But don't forget, and also in 1960, you had a similar circumstance, which I'm sure Reagan, who was had a very good understanding of communications, recalled the speech at the same spot delivered by a guy named John Kennedy, in which Kennedy said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which privately, as a small aside, I will tell you, the Germans always found amusing because he was trying to say, "I am a Berlin citizen," okay, like you, so we're behind you, is what he was trying to say. But actually in German, if you were going to say that, you would say, "Ich bin Berliner," okay? When you say, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which there's a jelly donut in Germany called a Berliner. So he's really was saying, "I am a jelly donut," okay? But people skipped over that. They understood what he was saying.
Right.
But in many ways, Reagan was underscoring that same sort of point at that particular moment.
Yeah. So Saddam invades Kuwait.
Yeah.
What are you thinking at this point, and what kind of preparations, or when do you find out, hey, we're going to deploy?
Yeah. Well, they deployed a corps there, and it became pretty clear that that corps, 18th Airborne Corps coming out of Bragg, was perhaps sufficient by having a large American presence to repel or at least deter an attack against Saudi Arabia, which is what was worried about.
Right.
But based on the fact that the 18th Airborne Corps was very light, I mean, the divisions involved were primarily the 82nd and the 101st. If you were going to conduct offensive military operations, you were going to have to import, a heavy armored corps. So when Saddam invades, I remember distinctly, we were in Grafenwehr doing major training exercises. And I got the whole battalion together on a parade field. And I said to him the following. I said, "Let me tell you something. Many people suggest you shouldn't let this particular event that just occurred in Kuwait bother you. What your commander is telling you, let it bother you. Let it bother you." Okay. Because if, in fact, a heavy corps is required for future operations in Kuwait, just look around the globe and look at where the heavy cores are. And we're a prime group sitting right here in Germany. So as we go out and train today, just as we did for years in preparation for the Soviets, who were no longer around, no longer a threat, as you're training today, and I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I ended up being a bit prophetic, train with the idea that we could, in very near future, be in combat somewhere else in the world, which is, that has turned out, that's what happened.
Yeah, yeah. In your estimation, the military had been preparing and training for conflict with the Soviets, which was a completely different animal from conflict with Iraq in the desert. Was the Army prepared in your mind to make that transition?
Yeah, I think really prepared, actually. I mean, we trained on a doctrine called air-land battle, a closer integration of air support and ground. And we basically executed that during Operation Desert Storm. That's exactly what we did. So I thought we were really well trained to do that. That being said, at the tactical level, did your tactics, techniques, and procedures change somewhat? Of course they did. In the desert, you're not going to put up green camouflage nets, which we used a lot in Germany because it's kind of pointless. And really what you're going to stress is mobility. In Germany, we knew for at least some significant period of time, we would be on the defense and would be in a retrograde movement backwards. And we knew in Iraq and Kuwait, we were going on the offense. Okay, we were going on the offense. But the big problem was, of course, if you're doing that, if you're retreating or retrograde or withdrawing or whatever you call it, trading space for time, you're kind of falling back on your logistical train. So actually, that becomes somewhat easier. Not easy because your opponent may try to interdict it, but somewhat easier. The Ukrainians have, at least in some ways, less of a logistical problem than the Russians do right now for that reason. Right. Now, when you get in the desert and you're going on high-speed offensive operations, then the whole logistical tail becomes a lot more complex. And that was truly what one of the main parts of the Gulf War was, really the logistical implications on the ground, without a doubt. I mean, I always tell people, an M1 tank is a fuel hog. Okay, you don't talk about miles per gallon, you talk about gallons per mile.
Right.
Okay? And no sophisticated piece of equipment is any good if it doesn't have any fuel. So we learned very early on in the Gulf War, as we prepared in Desert Shield, as we used to say, strategy and tactics is for amateurs, and logistics and sustainment is for professionals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. How long in advance did you know you were going to deploy? When you get the orders?
I was notified at a St. Barbara's Day ball. We had the St. Barbara's Day ball in early November. I think it's the 5th, 6th of November. And I was going through the receiving line, hosted by the commanding general of 7th Corps Artillery, who I knew pretty well, obviously. And he leaned, as I shook his hand, he leaned forward and he said to me, "We're going to Saudi Arabia." So that's how we had an inkling. There was a lot of talk in the air. President Bush had talked about deploying more forces, et cetera, et cetera. So we kind of had an inkling that it was, and we'd already started quietly doing some things to prepare, but that's when I actually was notified. And then, as I said, the plan was made up, as one of the Corps staff officers told me when first notified. He said, no, hearkening back to something we talked about before, he said, "You don't understand. We're deployed. We don't deploy." Okay. And we were out of there in about 30 days. So by 30 days after that St. Barbara's Day ball, we were sitting in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. How do you get there? How do you and all the equipment get there?
2 ways. Equipment went primarily by sea. So again, very heavy German cooperation. We could not have pulled this off without German cooperation, particularly in terms of rail and the German police. So the Germans put in total support for us as we got priority for the rail. So we ended up, loading, and we'd done that frequently anyway. Loading trains was something we did frequently to take our equipment up to Grafenwehr for training. So we knew how to do that. Yeah. And taking those equipment up to Hamburg and to the ports in northern Germany, clearing the roads for truck convoys. The Germans did all that. So it was really disruptive for German society. And then the ships would go out of Hamburg, and we'd be sitting there for a week or two just with soldiers and no equipment, doing final preparation. And then we'd get notified, went over to Nuremberg, and flew down to Dahran, a port on the Gulf side of Saudi Arabia. And then we're married up with the ships coming in, picked up the gear, and headed north.
Okay. And what are your first impressions when you get to Saudi Arabia?
You ever been to Saudi Arabia?
No.
Don't recommend it on your travel plan. This is a totally different, environment than anything I'd been used to, because all my operations had primarily been either in Kaunas or in Germany. So the whole austerity of the desert was the first thing that came to mind. And you realize quickly, as I said before, that logistical piece was key and essential. And one thing you had to be ultimately very concerned about was water. Water becomes in the desert very, very key because obviously based on heat, you can incapacitate an awful lot of people in a hurry. It also ends up being a determining factor on military operations. So we knew full well that if we were going to attack, let's say, north into Iraq and Kuwait, more than likely that was going to occur probably before middle April at the latest, because once you get beyond that, now you get in this unbelievable hot period of time. And if, as we ended up doing, you're going to wear chemical protective gear,
yep.
Well, there's no way you could wear that chemical protective gear and operate in Saudi Arabia in June, July, and August. There's just no way.
Yeah.
Just no way that can occur. Okay. So that is going to constrain your window of when you're going to conduct military operations. Even to the point, more narrowly, that when we arrived in Kuwait on the last night of the war, and I'm sitting astride the highway that connected Basra with Kuwait City with all the wreckage you may recall seeing on TV, we made an assumption, which I thought was fair, that any water sources we encountered were contaminated because Saddam Hussein's forces, as they withdrew, had destroyed and lit up all these oil fires. So you had this massive wall of flame where all these oil fires were going on the coastline there. So we figured, well, if he did that, he probably contaminated the water supply. Okay, so we can't use any of that water we find locally until we can get somebody up here to test the water. Well, back to logistics. Guess where the one guy in a corps is who can test water? Well, he's a couple hundred miles at least back across the desert, okay? Mm-hmm. So one of the things I was resupplied with by air, believe it or not, when we first got into Kuwait was water. And they dropped pallets of bottled water out of the back of a C-130 with a parachute. Doesn't work real well, but it was okay just for that. So one of the overarching things was the austerity of the environment, how different that was going to be for maneuver, and finally, of course, the constraints of logistics, particularly things like fuel and water.
Yeah. What is your objective once the ground war starts?
Well, our objective was we were direct support to the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Okay, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was the screening force for the 7th U.S. Corps. So we actually went into Iraq a day before the official start of the war. We did about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We did an artillery prep, and there was these big sand berms that defined the border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq that, as I understood it, were primarily put in there to reduce smuggling. Okay, and so did an artillery prep against some Iraqi positions there on the border. Marine engineers went in with Bangalore torpedoes, blew holes in these big dikes, and then we coordinated the movement of the cavalry and us into Iraq, moved up about 10, 15 miles or so, established a logger site, and that was to facilitate then the follow-on divisions. As we moved up into Iraq, our mission was to, as quickly as we could get to a phase line, which was called phase line smash. And we figured by that point we would encounter the Republican Guard divisions. The divisions that the Iraqis had deployed on the border were their regular Army divisions, which were less well-trained, less well-equipped, and had been beat up pretty bad by the Air Force. In fact, I recall a B-52 strike going in just a few days before we actually attacked north, I'm telling you, being within a few miles of a B-52 strike is something you always remember. So they had been beat up pretty bad. So we did have some contact and engagements, destroyed a lot of old Iraqi tanks and equipment, and then took massive numbers of prisoners. This also included, for the regiment I was with, the so-called Battle of the 7-3 Easting, which is talked about, which is really a company-size engagement. I think it was Eagle Troop, 2nd ACR, commanded by a great friend of mine, a guy named H.R. McMasters. He's retired lieutenant general now. And H.R. and his guys basically ran into an Iraqi battalion that was semi-dug in and at night, and there ended up being a gunfight. We fired some artillery in support of Eagle Troop, though their primary direct support battery or battalion came from another unit. And then we were to move on up until we made contact with the Republican Guards, the main Iraqi defense force. And then the plan was, which we executed, to do a passage of lines whereby the heavy divisions, 1st Division, 1st Cav, those guys, 1st Armored Division, would pass through the cavalry, and the cavalry would go back in being the Corps Reserve. And that was executed in the middle of the night, one of the scariest nights of my whole life, if you can imagine. Being in contact at night, doing a passage of lines in the dark, which a passage of lines is a difficult operation under the best of circumstances, and that was hardly the best of circumstances. And then once that happened, we were made reinforcing to a artillery battalion that was DS to a brigade of the 1st ID, and continued in that role on across Iraq and into Kuwait and all the way to the highway between Basra and Kuwait City.
Okay. What rank are you at this time?
Lieutenant Colonel.
Okay. And what is your responsibilities, Lieutenant Colonel?
Well, my primary responsibilities were, first of all, to prepare my unit for that particular mission. Okay, prepare them in Germany and then make the adjustments necessary in that new environment. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but we made some different decisions in how we deployed the guns now in the desert and offensive environment, as opposed to how we would have deployed them in Germany in what would have been initially a defensive environment. So what we wanted to do as much training as possible before we attacked to make sure we were at the best possible position when that actually began. Right. And then, maybe a funny story in a way, but I remember, ironically, I ended up being direct support to the 3rd Squadron, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, a battalion equivalent in size, because they put a whole battalion in support of a squadron for the covering force. Normally a battalion like mine would support an entire brigade. That squadron was commanded by a classmate of mine from West Point. His name was Scott Marcy, and sadly, Scott is now deceased. And I remember we made all this preparation, and Scott and I are standing on this little knoll in the desert. And the desert has one great advantage, and that is you can see forever. So I could literally see where my different batteries were deployed. And at the appointed hour, I could watch my watch at precisely 1 p.m., they were going to open fire. And I turned to Scott and I said, Scott, you know what? I said, most of our job is now over with. What's going to happen here in about 2 minutes is going to be determined by some great young lieutenants, corporals, and sergeants that we have prepared and positioned to be successful. And he looked at me and he said, you know what, Mac? You're right. Now, that doesn't mean I was just along for the ride. I was constantly trying to make sure that things continue to go, moving the unit around as required by the tactical situation, liaisoning. My main job was liaisoning initially with the 2nd Squadron or 3rd Squadron, and then with the commander of this brigade from 1ID to make sure we were positioned and coordinating our fire support effort to meet his requirements for maneuver, whatever he was going to plan on doing for maneuver.
Yeah. When you watch the news reports as it was going on, it appears as though our side was, it was almost a cakewalk, that the Iraqis really weren't that formidable. How was, from your position, was that true, or is that not, or was the Iraqis, did they put up a pretty good fight?
In some cases, they put up a pretty good fight. It damn sure wasn't a cakewalk. I mean, I think, again, people don't understand the magnitude of just getting there and getting prepared and positioned to do that.
Right.
I remember saying to my Corps artillery commander, I said, if we do all this and the Iraqis suddenly decide they're going to leave Kuwait and they pull out, and we never fire a single round in anger, this will still be one hell of an operation we just pulled off, okay, right. Which was damn sure not very easy, to say the very least. Number one. Number two, I got involved in 2 direct firefights with Iraqi tanks. We won one, we lost one. At the very last full night of the war, one of my fast-feed ammunition carriers, we were moving in the dark. It was really bad because not only was it dark, but the winds had shifted as we got closer and closer to the coast. And so the smoke from these oil fires was blowing across the land. Normally it blew out to sea, thank God, but sometimes it would blow into the land. And so you had the combination of it's night and it's dark to begin with, and then you got all this smoke, making it very difficult to see, even with night vision goggles. And those, you got to understand, the 2 biggest technological advantages we had that were essential to us being successful were GPS and night vision goggles. That put us in a position far and above the Iraqis right there. Right. So we literally ran into an Iraqi unit who I think was just trying to get the hell out of there. They were pulling back, and a gunfight ensued, which was a machine gun fight instead of a main gun fight, again, because it was difficult to see them, and the sighting for direct fire on a howitzer isn't great. And on a tank, they didn't have the kind of night vision sights on these T-62s that we would have on an M1. So for them to engage at night, so that's why I think it ended up being solely a machine gun fight. But in any event, the fast feed got hit, caught on fire, and exploded, and had well over 100 rounds of 155 artillery ammunition, a couple boxes of grenades, 20 claymores. I don't know how much small arms, but I'm telling you, that's one spectacular damn explosion, to say the least. Yeah. All the soldiers on that particular vehicle got off miraculously, got rescued by the supply truck driver in what I thought was a miraculous event. So even though that occurred, we didn't lose anybody, and we pulled back that night and consolidated, because tanks against artillery is not a good thing. Trust me. Right. And the remaining Iraqis, the CAV came up alongside, took out a couple of their tanks, and a few others, I think, got away.
Yeah. You mentioned that you were in 2 tank battles. You won one, you lost one.
Yeah.
How's that measured? How's the wins and losses measured in something like that?
Well, when you get them and they don't get you, that's called a win, okay? And so we got involved in another direct firefight with an Iraqi tank and took him out, okay? And I happened to be there and pull up alongside, and I'm sure that artillery section chief staff sergeant, to his dying day, well, that'll be one of the greatest things that ever happened to him. So for an artillery guy to take out a tank is not common in any war, trust me.
Right.
But they engaged it and were able to get the round off and take out this. I think it was it was at least a T-62, might even been a T-55, because the Iraqis had some older tanks they'd gotten from the Soviets, right. And they took these guys out.
Yeah. What was one thing that surprised you the most about Desert Storm?
Well, I guess a couple of things. One is, the resilience of American soldiers. Mm-hmm. I mean, again, you quantify capabilities of military forces when we talk about how many guns you got and the ranges and all those things you can measure, the objective calculation. You don't measure the subjective calculation, okay? And this is an advantage that can't be measured and is one of the greatest advantages we can. The American soldier will figure it out. Okay, yeah. Okay. Silly example. We had a few night vision goggles, but the big problem was batteries for these things, okay? And the whole logistical effort to come back to that was difficult, So you would go to Supply Point, which would be a huge place, acres and acres, and you go up there and say, I need some batteries that are about that big, right? And some supply sergeant would say, we got those. I'd say, great. How about issuing them to me? Okay. And he'd look out at this big field of these 40-foot trailers and he'd go, they're out there somewhere. I have no idea where they are, but I know we got some, but I have no idea where they are. I mean, this was like the Raiders of the Lost Ark warehouse.
Right.
Okay. So we're trying to figure out how to use these things. So one day I'm sitting in my tent. There's a wrap at the tent flap. I walk out, and here's one of my commo guys, PFC Spec 40. He goes, hey, sir, I figured this out. I said, what'd you figure out? He said, how to fix these night vision goggles. I said, what'd you do? He said, well, I cut a piece of WD-1, which is just wire, and I took a drill and cut a hole in my flashlight, which is on my web gear, and then I hot wired the night vision goggles with the wire to my flashlight. So every time I turn on my flashlight, the night vision goggles come on. Now that sounds pretty small. That's
right.
huge.
Oh yeah.
Okay. I said, you're a hero, man. And they'll just step forward, and when things will get tough, somebody will step forward and pick it up.
Yeah.
And that's obviously what you want, and that's what hopefully that's the way you train.
Yeah. How long are you there in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait?
We got there in early December, and we came back in early May.
Okay.
So what happened to us was we went through the whole thing, ended up just south of Safwan where the negotiations were conducted. In fact, my final mission was to actually have pre-planned artillery targets around the negotiating location just in case the Iraqis got spunky while those negotiations were going on. And then we were pulled back from there into Iraq into kind of a reserve position. And then around late March, early April, we were dispatched back north up on the Euphrates River, which was a separation line between us and the Iraqis, because the basic deal was that those units that arrived first went home first. The 101st Airborne, which had come in with 18th Airborne Corps in the fall, were holding that position. They were pulling out, so we went up to replace them. And we were up there for a month or 6 weeks. In many ways, that was some of the worst part of the entire war, quite frankly, because we were there just sitting there. The Iraqis would toss an artillery round at us every once in a while just to make sure we were still around.
Right.
But what was terrible about it was there was this large-scale Shiite rebellion in southern Iraq against Saddam. And unfortunately, sufficient his combat power, Republican Guards, had survived. But they went back into these villages just on the other side of the river and just massacred these people. I mean, it was about as brutal as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So I could sit on a camp stool outside my tent at night and watch the machine gun fire and mortars going into these little villages, Samawa, Nazaria on the north side of the river. And then there were some bridges that were partially destroyed but could still be walked across. And we're literally taking thousands of refugees are fleeing across the river from Iraq into where we were controlling the terrain. And this is just a horrific circumstance. I mean, I literally had to tell my soldiers, as awful as it will sound, do not feed the refugees. And the reason is you learn that in a refugee situation, when a refugee finds a place that provides food, they stop right there.
Yeah.
Okay. And what you got to do is we've got to encourage them to keep moving farther south where the United Nations had established refugee camps that could more care for them, because obviously we just physically couldn't handle all this. But we still got involved. I remember going down to one of the bridges, and there's my PA pulled up on the side of the road with his Humvee, and he's doing basic surgery for a gunshot wound to an Iraqi on the hood of his Humvee. Okay. And I said, hey, Doc, how's it going? And he looked at me, he said, sir, this guy needs to be in an intensive care ward, and I'm doing meatball surgery on the hood of a Humvee. Right. I remember one morning we discovered it. A bunch of them had camped around our positions, and a woman had delivered a baby in the ditch outside of our perimeter. Okay.
Wow.
So you got all that kind of stuff going. And usually the other thing about refugees is I've been in several refugee situations. refugees are 75 to 80% elderly, women, and children.
Yeah. At some point, you debriefed all this, I'm assuming. What were some of what were things that could have been done better that you guys discovered?
The logistical piece was the key thing, and I keep coming back to that. But another quick story to illustrate how difficult it was. We actually captured some 155 older 155 self-propelled howitzers that had actually been in the Kuwaiti army that the Iraqis had captured when they invaded Kuwait in August. So we captured these back. I immediately put my mechanics to work to cannibalize these particular vehicles of all the spare parts we could possibly get off of them, just to keep us going.
Right.
Okay. So the whole logistical piece was key and essential, and you had to constantly worry about resupply. Food was never a problem. You can haul lots of MRAs. That's not a problem. Okay. Ammo really wasn't a problem, though you have to move that stuff around, and you found a lot of the vehicles that we had for resupply in Germany, large trucks, which would operate great on Autobahns, doesn't mean they're going to operate great in the middle of the desert. And we learned as we advanced north into Iraq that the second tier of our basic load of ammo all got stuck in these berms trying to traverse into Iraq. So the more successful we were on the offense, the farther away we were from our next load of ammo.
Right.
Okay. And then the whole water thing was a big deal as well, because we believed that there was a high probability that the Iraqis would employ chemical or bio weapons. So we were taking pills and doing all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And if you think you might be hit by something like that, as we say, think you might get slimed, one of the main things you need to decontaminate is lots of water, okay? Which is one thing that obviously is in short supply. So the logistical piece was thing that could have went better, okay? The whole, we were at the forefront of this, the whole GPS thing. I mean, our ability to navigate. We started out trying to navigate using, map and compass, which we did in Germany. Well, Germany's easy because you got roads and towns, and it's pretty easy to navigate there. Now I remember getting issued all these maps of Saudi Arabia, and you unfold them, and it's like a big white piece of paper. There's, and any relief you see, whether it was a small hill or whatever, or a trail or whatever, doesn't mean it's really there, because it was there when the map was made, but the wind's blown and there's been a sandstorm, and that's all gone away. Okay. Yeah. So the GPS and our ability to maneuver was without a doubt essential. I often say if it hadn't been for GPS, hell, I'd still be in the desert in Iraq trying to find my way home. And I was told this is true, that an Iraqi senior officer was captured, and they were just shocked by our ability to do that big hook through the desert, because he said to his interrogators, look, we used to go out there and train, and every time we went out there, we got lost. Okay. And they showed him a GPS, and he immediately realized how key and essential that had been. And their defenses, I think, made the assumption that we couldn't do that. I mean, they thought we were going to go high diddle up the main highway right there along the coast. So that's where their primary defense was. When we got into Kuwait, I remember going out on the shore, and there were gun positions the Iraqis had dug in, all kinds of beach defenses and whatever, all pointing out to the sea, because they expected a marine amphibious landing. And by the way, there were a whole lot of unhappy Marines who spent their whole war doing circles out in the Persian Gulf and never landed. So they were pretty unhappy people. And they thought we were going to do some kind of an airborne assault, 82nd, 101st, somewhere outside of Kuwait City. So main attack up the highway, Marines come ashore, airborne air assault on the outside of Kuwait. And that's the way it was going to work. And there were sand tables for the senior Iraqi staff that were captured that indicated that's what they were preparing for. So the whole thing kind of became a surprise to them in some ways. And once we started rolling them up, they couldn't reverse it. And then last but not least, of course, one's got to, I don't ever want to be in a war in which the United States Air Force is on the other side. I don't want to be in that particular war because once the air campaign started, it was successful in fixing the Iraqis where they were because they knew full well if they moved, they would be exposed, vulnerable, and be destroyed from the air.
Right. Fast forward a little bit. The next major engagement the United States is involved in is Kosovo. And you played a role in
Bosnia, Kosovo. Yeah,
you played a role in that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I was. I'd worked in the Pentagon. I'd worked on European security issues. In addition to being an artilleryman, I was also a European foreign area officer. And I got involved in a lot of arms control and negotiations, particularly the CFE treaty. And so one bright day, I was dean of the Army War College, and I got a phone call from a guy who was a senior director and counselor of the president on the NSC staff. And he said to me, he said, I've got a problem. And I said, everybody's got problems. What's your problem? And he said, well, my problem is that we're getting ready to close this treaty with the Soviets, with the Russians and the Europeans. And the person I have working on it here on the NSC staff has to leave. She was having a baby. And we need somebody who can step in, who understands the issues, got the clearances, can go to work like tomorrow, And I think you're the guy. And I said, well, that's very kind of you. But I have a day job. Okay, I was the dean of the Army War College, so I have a day job. Thank you very much. And he said, "Well, I know this is inconvenient, but I just got off the phone with the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they both think it'd be a terrific idea if you came down, if you came down here and went to work. Okay, and if you've been in the Army for more than 20 minutes, if something like that happens." Best thing for you to do is go home, tell your wife what's about to go down, and start packing your duffel bag. That's what's going to happen. So off I went. And then the Kosovo thing explodes. I think it was around St. Patrick's Day, as I recall. And I am sucked into the Kosovo Task Force, which is an interagency task force, NSC, CIA, primarily NSC, CIA, DOD, as well as the Joint Staff on different aspects of Kosovo policy. And then based on what I was working on, had to go to Brussels, I forget once or twice, to meet with different members of the alliance. And it was a fascinating experience. I think the two things I would take away from it is trying to keep 30 countries all heading in this. I think we were about 20 countries then, though, heading in the same direction is a lot harder than anybody imagines. And behind all the happy face pictures, there's an awful lot of hard work that's got to do to keep everybody on board, because everybody's got their own interests. Okay,
right.
That's one. Number two is, and so we were successful in doing that. And right in the middle of it had been scheduled in April of 1999, and this had been scheduled for a long time, was a NATO summit, which was held in Washington. And it was going to be the 50th anniversary of NATO, okay? And so not only is it a NATO summit, but it's this anniversary summit only a few years after the end of the Cold War. So this is great. Big celebration, going to be great. Well, that particular celebration, and I was involved in that, went from being a lot of, white tie dinners and the wives showing up. No, it almost overnight became a council of war. Wives didn't come. Nobody brought the tux. No, this was all about Kosovo. Okay.
Right.
And then finally, I would say this thing, Kosovo is a footnote in history. It only lasted a few months.
Yep.
But it could have gone so south in so many different ways. And we could have ended up in a major confrontation, particularly with the Russians. And that almost happened in Pristina between a Russian unit and some British units as they moved in there. And then last but not least, I remember, can I swear? Can I use foul language on this?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So I remember in the middle of this whole thing, if you're on the task force, you're privy to all this classified email traffic that's shared amongst everybody in the task force. So about a couple of weeks into this air campaign, this message came across, which was from I'm sure it was, as I recall, from the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. And
Okay.
Madeleine wrote in this message to all of us. She said, we are now at phase 3 of this air campaign. There's a phase 1, phase 2. We're now at phase 3 of this air campaign. And this son of a bitch, meaning Milosevic, is not giving up. And there ain't a phase 4. I remember she used the word ain't, and we ain't got no phase 4. So what in the hell are we going to do now? Okay. So we could have ended up in a we were preparing for a major ground invasion.
Yeah.
Coming up through either Albania or through Greece and Macedonia into Serbia, in the mountains, and of course back to weather and timing. I think, as I remember, we figured the campaign, if we had to do it on the ground, was going to take about 60 days. So we wanted it to be over by early to mid-October. Well, you back off that. You say, okay, then this thing has got to kick off on or about the 1st of August. So, okay. Mm-hmm. Then in June and July, you're physically putting forces on the ground, gathering them in position, logistics and everything to begin that kind of major ground operation. If you got to pull these people up like carrots. Yeah. So we were that close to doing that when things actually went to negotiations.
Yeah. Hmm. What year did you retire?
I retired in January 1972, or January, 2002.
2002. Okay, so you were still in the Army during 9/11.
I was. Oddly, it was really weird. I had been dean of the War College for several years. I was going to retire sometime in 2002, and I had been asked to take a position as a civilian professor at the Naval Academy. So I'd spoken to the commandant at the time, because our academic year at the War College begins in June and ends in June. It's a 1-year course. So I said to him in the spring of 2001, I said, hey, boss, I think the best thing is for you to select a new dean. So he starts with the new class, and he's there for the entire academic year, because I'm going to be leaving sometime during the year. I had to have, for some old injuries, I had to have 2 operations on my legs, so I knew there was going to be other things going on.
Right.
So he agreed. So come September 11th, 2001, where am I? Well, I'm in Spain, of course. What am I doing in Spain? I've been invited over there to some kind of a conference by the Spanish Ministry of Defense. I don't remember the details. And I was supposed to be, that morning, I was supposed to go into a big conference room in the Spanish Ministry of Defense and give a talk, I think on NATO or something like that, to a large group of senior Spanish military officers and government civilians in the Ministry of Defense. So I show up at the appointed place and time, and we're in kind of an ante room, and all of a sudden this Spanish officer comes in, he grabs me, and he pulls me over to another room where there was a television. And as we sat down, the second plane hit. The first plane had already hit. That's why he came and got me. I sat down and we saw the second plane hit, But everybody was in the conference room waiting for me to speak. And so I remember getting up and walking to this conference room, and I had this speech in my hand, and I just crumbled it up and threw it in a wastebasket and went in and faced these people. And I can't remember in any great detail what I said, but I do remember I said the following. We don't know who did this right now, but we're going to figure out who it was. And I guarantee every person in this room is members of the Alliance and our allies. When we figure this out, we're going to go get them. So just get ready.
Yeah. Did you know at the time, did you have a sense of how significant that day was, and that it would be essentially the kickoff for almost a 20-year war?
No, nobody did. I came back, though, most interestingly, to the War College a week later, and I guess I can talk about this now. The Army staff decided to have a major strategic planning conference at the War College, a classified planning conference, because we have the facilities here for that kind of classified conferencing. So the entire Army staff comes to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and we spent about 4 or 5 days. And it was basically a discussion of the entire Army leadership, to include active guard and reserve leadership, of just what the hell are we going to do? Okay. And so I was involved in that, and we ran a few exercises, war planning exercises, and I was asked to play the role of the national security advisor because of my experience working on the NSC staff. And I got to tell you, nobody envisioned the 20-year war. We envisioned it could be, and the phrase "the long war" came out pretty quickly. And everything we considered about everything you can imagine. I mean, I remember a deep discussion on whether or not the Army in particular should go to, frankly, the leadership of the country and say, you need to bring back conscription. Mm-hmm. We need conscription now. Okay. And again, a lot of questions about the National Guard and reserves, again, because the National Guard and the reserves, particularly the National Guard, had primarily had back to missions, had two missions. National Guard mission was one, those things that occur within the state boundaries, whether they're forest fires or floods or hurricanes or tornadoes, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. You know? And the second was they were to prepare for the big one over there in Europe with the Soviets.
Right.
And at some point in time, as you know, things escalated, they would be called up, sent out for final training, and then deployed as part of that effort. Okay. But now we're talking about not using them for that big war. We're talking about, so they were what I would call overall, with a small r, a reserve force. Yes, you have the reserves, capital R, and the Guard, but they are a reserve force to the active. Okay. But now as things start to turn out, we're talking about the National Guard as a rotational force. That's a whole different problem, particularly for a professional force that's based on enlistment as opposed to conscription.
Yeah.
Can you continue to do force generation if you tell this guy who lives in Wyoming, oh, by the way, every 3 years you get to visit Afghanistan or Iraq? I mean, that's a whole different problem.
Yeah. Okay.
But all those kind of things were discussed during that planning conference for the Army staff in preparation for what we thought was going to happen. Also one of the big concerns was 9/11 an isolated event? Really a lot of worry about that. Or was this the first, and we're going to start seeing more and more attacks all around the world against our bases and installations? Yeah. And what that would mean for force generation, that was discussed too.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you think, looking back on it, how do you think that your wartime experience has affected who you would become?
Well, that's a great question. It's sobering. I remember sitting down with a group of corporate guys one night after a dinner where I'd been a speaker, and we're having a beer, and this one guy leans over to me and he says, "Oh, tell us a great war story." And I said, "There's no such thing." Yeah, I can tell you things that happened that were funny, because in the chaos of combat, I mean, combat is essentially, I would argue, long periods of mind-numbing boredom followed by short periods of very intense activity. Okay?
Yeah.
So there's no such thing as a great war story. I can tell you things that were amusing or funny or whatever, but anybody that thinks this is glorious somehow has never been in one.
Yeah.
Okay? It's horrible. The price in terms of human beings, resources, is just extraordinary. The impact it has on people, goes on forever. I think about my time in combat probably every day.
Yeah.
Okay. It doesn't bother me. I don't dwell on it. I don't think I'm certainly not crippled by it, but it's a unique part of what happened to me in my life that will never, ever go away. So to that degree, it definitely sobered me. And it also taught me, as I said before, that human beings are unbelievably resilient, and they can take a lot more than you think and probably that they think.
Yeah. Yeah. What is something you would like someone to know who might watch this video decades into the future? What would you want them to know about your service?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is it sounds all pretty awful, but in some ways, the things that you've talked about. But overall, I really enjoyed my service. Okay, I'm very proud of my service to the nation, which I love so much. Number one. Number two, it was very good to me in terms of it was unbelievably personally rewarding because of what I did in the Army. The military sent me back to get a master's degree and a doctorate. I taught at West Point. I taught at the Army War College, being the dean of the War College. So I had some unbelievable experiences there. The people I met and got to know in the military are some of the finest people that you can imagine. And the one thing that I think any veteran would tell you is the people you serve with in the military, and particularly the people you serve with in extreme circumstances like combat, they're your friends forever. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And some of those guys could call me right now, or I could call them right now and say, hey, I need you here tomorrow or as quick as you can get here, and they'd be here.
Yeah.
And that's just an amazing as part of that particular experience. And then last but not least, I tell young people, I teach college, and I tell young people, I say, life actually is very short and you go through a lot more quickly than you can ever imagine. I really recommend to anybody that somewhere, it's usually when you're younger, come out of college, come out of high school, be part of something that's bigger than you are.
Yeah.
Be part of something that's doesn't have to be the military, though obviously the military is an option. You can go to the Peace Corps, you can work for AmeriCorps, you can be part of a large nonprofit, you can go on a religious mission if that's your persuasion. I don't care. Be part of something that's bigger than you are, because that particular experience will teach you more about yourself and the world and society than any other thing you could do. Yeah, if you want to go make money, that's great. But trust me, you got plenty of time to go make some money. Probably that period of time when you're 18 to 25 is about the only period of time in your life where you're going to have that opportunity. So don't miss it.
Yeah, that's very well said. Couldn't agree more with that statement. Well, Jeff, on behalf of the Americans in Wartime Experience, I want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to share your story. And although this sometimes seems cliche, I promise you it's not. I want to thank you very much for your service to your country.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
Hey, Dennis, thanks for your service and what you're doing right now. I think it's commendable. And thank you for what has been really, for me, an enjoyable and fun interview.
Good. I'm very glad. I'm glad that it was.
Yeah.